2,500 years ago, in spring and autumn period China, neighboring states were going to war once, even twice a year. Hard power was the only currency that mattered, and nobody had it more than Duke Jing of Qi. He had 4,000 warhorses. In the ancient world, that was a staggering amount of military hardware. He was one of the most powerful men alive, but when he died, nobody wept, nobody cared. He was forgotten almost instantly. Hundreds of years before, two brothers named Bo-yi and Shu-qi had 0 horses, 0 army. In fact, they starved to death in the wilderness because they refused on principle to eat the grain of a ruler they thought to be corrupt. And yet, for hundreds of years following their death, people couldn't stop talking about them. Confucius looked at these two extremes and realized something profound. 4,000 warhorses can't make people care about you when you're gone. But a bizarre, starving act of moral conviction could be remembered for 1,000 years. There was a completely different kind of power operating in the world. An invisible, gravitational force he called De. And in this episode's passage, he's trying to explain it to a guy who only understands war horses. Exploring the Analects, Episode 9, Passage 15.4. You're out there in the trenches. Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 9 of Exploring the Analects. Today we'll be talking about Passage 15.4 of the Analects, in which Confucius tells his disciple, Zilu, that few individuals living during their time genuinely grasp the significance of De, or moral charisma. This is an episode about whether or not might makes right, what can happen to social order during a centuries-long power vacuum, and what Confucius believed could restore peace to his own world. If you're just joining me for the first time, here's a little overview of the podcast. We're working our way through the Analects, a collection of hundreds of passages written by the followers of Confucius between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. Each episode delves into one or more passages. We read the passages in Chinese and English, explain their basic meaning, and discuss the historical and cultural context to provide a deeper understanding. After that, we analyze the language found in the passages as a way to learn new words and phrases in classical Chinese and modern Mandarin. And don't forget, I've recently set up Analects.net, where you can listen to each episode and follow along with an episode guide. Episode guides include Chinese characters for the passages, as well as other words mentioned in the episode. The site also has the full text of the Analects, with smart searching and pop-up definitions. Check it out and let me know what you think. You can reach me at elliot@analects.net. Let's get started. This is my informal interpretation of passage 15.4. Remember, this isn't a translation, but I wanted to capture something about the spirit of the passage that sticks with you for the rest of the episode. Kiddo, you're out there in the trenches, but I promise you, there's a better way to fight the good fight. If you can find one of the rare people who knows how, you've got to learn to lead. Now I'll read the passage in a modern Mandarin pronunciation, and then we'll follow up with a little more faithful translation into English. 子曰：有，知德者鲜矣， the master said, "Zilu, my child, there sure are few people nowadays who really understand moral charisma." Here we see Confucius addressing his disciple Zilu, reminding him that de, or moral charisma, is a quality rarely possessed, let alone truly understood, by the people of 6th century BCE China. Next, I want to give you a sense of just who the people of 6th century BCE China were. So I'm going to mix things up a bit and talk about some of the historical context behind the Analects before I get into the meaning of this passage. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the spring and autumn period of Chinese history. Confucius lived during the Zhou dynasty, a roughly 8th century period from 1046 to 256 BCE. And of course, since it was a dynasty, the entire period was populated by a succession of kings from the same royal house, surnamed Qi. These kings ruled over a region centered on the North China Plain, at least nominally, for all of those hundreds of years. The Zhou also used a vassalage system where lords of small internal states recognized the authority of the Zhou king and exercised some autonomy within their own regions. Now, when I say the Zhou kings ruled at least nominally for this entire 800 years, that's the key to understanding how this long period is subdivided. In 770 BCE, the original Zhou capital was sacked by a nomadic people from the west, forcing the court to flee east. The Zhou kings re-established themselves in their new capital, and this marked the beginning of the Eastern Zhou, as well as the start of the spring and autumn period. After the move, things were never quite the same for the Zhou kings. They were still formally recognized by their vassals, but year by year, the vassals acted with more independence in their own territories, and with less care when it came to their obligations to the royal court. By the time Confucius was born, in 551 BCE, things had been deteriorating for over 200 years. Local rulers adopted styles and customs that were supposed to be reserved for the royal house only. They started their own tribute systems among aristocrats who owed no loyalty to the Zhou. During the spring and autumn period, armed conflicts between these local rulers increased, occurring on average between once and twice a year. That fragmented and chaotic world was the backdrop for Confucius's conversation with Zilu. They looked back to the earliest days of the Zhou and saw a time of harmony and prosperity. They saw an ineffectual royal court that was openly disregarded by its subjects, and they saw that this disregard resulted in a kind of trickle-down effect to the point that even in their home state of Lu, the hereditary ruler was a ruler in name only. In Lu, power had been usurped by 3 local aristocratic families, who acted as de facto rulers in the state. Confucius's class, the ritualist Rujia, was stuck in the middle of it all. They were masters of ceremony and court advisors, so they often served these poorly behaved aristocratic families and disenfranchised hereditary rulers. But they also served communities of commoners, organizing festivals, conducting family rites, and advising on issues causing problems locally. The commoners might not understand what caused their granary to run out or their crops to fail, and the aristocrats might not understand that their backstabbing and jockeying might be emulated at all levels of society. But the Rujia saw it all, and Confucius felt if people could just act with de, or moral charisma, peace and prosperity would return almost effortlessly. In order to promote this quality in society, one of his goals was to build up the quality among his own students. If they could become moral centers of gravity and then go out to serve the local rulers, This could help rectify those rulers themselves, and eventually bring harmony to their subjects. Now that you've got some historical context, let's move on to an analysis of the passage. This one comes with a disclaimer and reminder that we're dealing with 6 ideograms with no punctuation, no intonation, and possible scribal errors. These characters were written millennia ago, and scholars themselves have had varied and conflicting interpretations. So do I know for sure what they mean? No. Does anyone today? Also no. If someone says they're sure about what it means, take that with a grain of salt. And remember passage 2.17. Real wisdom is knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. By the end of this episode, you'll know what the words mean, who Zilu was, what the spring and autumn period China was like, and a bit more about moral charisma. You won't know for sure what this passage means, and that's okay. This passage consists of 3 core elements. First, Confucius speaks to his disciple, Zilu, with a familiar form of address. Second, he raises the topic of de, or moral charisma. And third, he comments on the knowledge and character of people of his time. Working through each of these elements should leave us with some reasonable guesses as to why he would be saying this. So let's start by learning about the disciple Zilu. If you listen to episode 2, Teachers Aren't Gatekeepers, or episode 6, The Corner Office, you'll already have some context on Confucius' disciples. But I'll do a quick review here just to get everyone up to speed. Throughout the Analects, Confucius' disciples are mentioned over 500 times. So you can be sure that this group as a whole is about as central to the book as Confucius himself. They came from beggar families and the political elite. Some were businessmen, and others were government officials. Some were nearly the same age as Confucius himself, and others were 50 years younger. Zilu is one of the most frequently mentioned disciples. He appears dozens of times throughout the Analects, as well as in a number of later texts, such as the Shi, or the Record of the Grand Historian, written in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE by father and son Sima Tan and Sima Qian. He's also mentioned in the Kongzi Jiayu, or the Family Sayings of Confucius, another 2nd century BCE work believed to be compiled by a descendant of Confucius. These sources tell us a number of important things about Zilu that explain why Confucius would direct this comment to him of all disciples. Zilu was a fighter who came from the wilderness in a distant quarter of Confucius's home state of Lu. The sources we mentioned above refer to him as a yeren, literally someone from the wilds, as opposed to a guoren, or city person, who lived within the fortified urban settlements. One colorful passage from the records of the Grand Historian described Zilu as wearing a cap decorated with the feathers of a rooster and a belt or sword wrapped with boar-leather. It's written that when he first met Confucius, he even attempted to mock and intimidate him before accepting him as his teacher. Regardless of whether or not these stories are true, in the Analects itself, he often appears as an example of someone who easily gets angry and can be aggressive and brave to a fault. Famously, in passage 15.2, Confucius and his followers run out of food while traveling, and reacts with anger and frustration that Confucius finds unnecessary. Passage 11.13 tells us that he's not destined to die a natural death, and his fate is actually corroborated by yet another classical source, the Zuozhuan, or the Zuo commentary on the Spring and Autumn Annals. Assuming we take that source as factual, we learn that he died fighting against a coup attempt in the palace of the state of Wei. So now we have a reasonable guess as to why Confucius was addressing Zilu out of all his students. He was concerned about his disciples' rash nature and was urging him to learn to control his temper and fight only when it was truly the correct course of action. Even if Zilu did eventually die a violent and quite gruesome death, it seems that Confucius brought him much further than he would have otherwise gone in life. From living in a remote area, wearing shabby clothes, and personally carrying grain to his family, Zilu eventually went on to work in official positions within a ducal court. And when he did die, it wasn't because he had a temper tantrum and picked a random fight. It was because he was defending a leader he had chosen to serve. Moving on to the next part of this passage, Confucius has raised the topic of de, or moral charisma. If you want a real deep dive into this concept, you should definitely listen to episode 5, Won't You Be My Neighbor? But in this context, what you should remember is that it would be highly uncharacteristic of someone with great moral charisma to rush into battle. The opposite should happen with such a person. They would attract many other righteous individuals into their orbit, and ideally, their own conduct would set an example so excellent that the threat of violence would recede as harmony increased. That final point, that the threat of violence would recede, is one aspect of de that we haven't taken a deep dive into just yet. And given Zilu's character, I think this is the right time to do it. Moral charisma is often contrasted with coercive force in the Analects. Remember, this is a nearly divine power to attract the good and rectify the crooked, and its description throughout the Analects is like gravity, something that can't be seen or felt directly, but nonetheless affects everything around it. That's the opposite of being coerced through force or threats. Here are a few examples of the contrast. In passage 16.12, we read that the Duke Jing of Qi had 4,000 horses at his disposal, but no legacy of moral charisma to be remembered for. This is contrasted with the legendary princes Bo-yi and Shu-qi, who were praised for centuries because they went into self-exile and starved to death, rather than serve a lord to whom they had no loyalty. In passage 7.23, Confucius is threatened with violence by Huantui, but says he has no fear of it due to the moral charisma he has cultivated. 9.18 contrasts moral charisma with the physical, when Confucius laments that people seem unable to value it as much as physical appearance or sexual attraction. And in 12.19, we hear that the powerful leader, Ji Kangzi, one of those leaders of the 3 houses that I mentioned earlier, is wondering if killing the wicked would make the world a better place. Confucius replies, famously telling him that moral charisma is like a righteous wind that blows to bend the people like grass. I could give quite a few more examples here, but you probably get the point. Confucius believes violence and virtue are opposing forces, and considering Zilu's hot-headed nature, this is an important lesson for him. The final aspect of this passage that we'll discuss is what I'd call the flywheel effect of moral charisma. When you're at a full stop, it takes an enormous amount of energy to get rolling. But when you're on a roll, just a little extra push keeps you going, or might even speed things up. Both violence and virtue are subject to the flywheel effect. One fight can spiral into a blood feud that kills dozens, and one gift can inspire a dozen acts of kindness. In my opinion, that's why Confucius mentions how few people of his time really understand moral charisma. What he's trying to tell Zilu is that living in a chaotic era like China was in the 6th century BCE spring and autumn period, there were few people who have moral charisma, and few people having it means few people can recognize it or understand what it really is. Lots of people believe they understand it, one famous example being the so-called village worthy, the type of person who's most concerned with making sure that their whole town is convinced of their righteousness. In 17.13, Confucius calls people like this the thieves of De. He has similar complaints about what people of his time actually do value, like clever words and impressive appearances, mentioned in 1.3 and 6.16. So let's summarize what we're dealing with here and wrap up this section. Confucius is addressing his student Zilu, who has a nasty habit of wanting to fight instead of resolving problems with a little more civility. He's reminding Zilu that violence and moral charisma are opposing forces, and so he needs to learn to control his temper if he wants to improve his virtuous nature. Finally, Confucius is explaining to Zilu that cultivating his moral charisma isn't going to be easy. There's no running start he can get in their world. That's because there are so few people who have it, let alone understand it. And to the contrary, lots of people are pretty confused about what it really is. Next up, I'm going to discuss some of the language we see in this passage. The goal here is to have something of benefit to language learners at any level. So if you don't find something for you, just give me a shout at elliot@analects.net, and I'll see what I can do for you. I'll assume you already know what Zilu is all about. If not, just listen to episode 1. So we'll start with Yo. Yo is the personal name of Zilu. His family name was Zhong. So at birth, his full name was Zhong Yo. This might be a bit confusing, since we've discussed previously that Zhong was also often part of courtesy names indicating one was the second-born son, like in Confucius's own courtesy name, Zhongni. But in this case, it doesn't actually mean that. It's just his family name. Many disciples of Confucius are referred to with a zi before a part of their name, and this is the case with Zilu. His courtesy name was Jilu, indicating he was the fourth-born son. One other note here. Since Confucius is addressing him as Yo in this case, it gives the passage more of a personal and familiar tone, as well as one of an elder addressing someone of the younger generation. Zilu's peers would not have referred to him as Yo. Only someone older, either from his family or someone very familiar with him, would use this name. Next up, let's talk about zhi. This literally means to know. This is the same character that's used in modern Chinese in compound words like 知道, to know, and 知识, knowledge. One interesting note about zhi in the context of the Analects is that it's sometimes used in place of zhi, or wisdom, and because of this, traditional commentators may discuss whether or not they believe such a substitution has occurred. In this case, although I didn't find any such discussion about substitutions, there is discussion in traditional commentaries of what the actual meaning of zhi is here. 19th century commentator Huang Kan believes that to know really means to be. So the phrase 知德者 means the morally charismatic or the virtuous. Almost like you might call someone a driver or say that they know how to drive. My analysis above comes to a similar conclusion. Although we can't be totally sure that Confucius was referring to people who have de as opposed to people who just understand it, it's kind of a moot point. Those who really know it probably have it, and those who have it, know it as well. We'll skip discussion of de since we've already done a bit of that in this episode and in previous episodes. But I definitely encourage you to listen to episode 5 for that deep dive that I mentioned. Zhe has the same function here as it does in modern Chinese. It acts as a sort of agent suffix, like we use the suffix in English when we talk about writers, speakers, and actors. A couple of modern Chinese words that we see with this are 记者, reporter, and 受害者, victim. In this case, we see it used in the 3-character phrase mentioned above, 知德者, which could be read together as morally charismatic people, or more literally as people who know moral charisma. Xian is a tricky one if you've already learned it in modern Chinese. It does not mean fresh or new. This is actually third tone instead of first tone, and in this case it means rare or few. This is the case for every usage of this character throughout the Analects. It always indicates that something is uncommon. Finally, there's yi. This is a 虚词, or classical grammatical particle, and most similar to le in modern Chinese, which honestly doesn't tell you much, except that it can have many different usages. One function it has here is to end the sentence, but in addition to that, it provides a bit of tone, making the sentence more emphatic than it would otherwise have been. In some cases, you'll see sentences like this rendered with an exclamation point. Other renderings might turn it into alas, or otherwise indicate a sense of frustration or regret. In my translation above, I turn it into sure, just to naturally give the statement a tone of judgment or frustration that's found in the original. Last up, I'm going to mention some of the discussion of this phrase in traditional commentaries. I'm excited about this section this time because I recently got my hands on a copy of Cheng Shude's book, 论语解释. This book was published in the early 20th century and gives a high-level summary of many hundreds of other commentaries on the Analects. So reading the section for any given passage really gives a huge amount of insight into the main arguments that have been made for it over hundreds or even thousands of years. One argument is that this passage was erroneously swapped at some point with passage 15.3. Some scholars believe this could have happened at some point when the passages were being compiled on bamboo strips. Those who believe this happened say it makes more sense for this passage to be next to 15.2 because 15.2 also mentioned Zilu. 15.2 is the passage where he gets mad when Confucius and his disciples run out of food while traveling. So scholars who support this argument believe that it's a continuation of that situation, and this should be read as Confucius chastising Zilu and telling him that he has a lot of work to do before he understands what de really means. Cheng Shude rejects this interpretation. He points out that the first two passages in Book 15 don't seem to have any geographical or temporal connection, so it would be a mistake to assume that 15.2 and 15.4 are supposed to have such a connection. Instead, he and Huang Can interpret this passage as simply a lament by Confucius to his student about the lack of virtuous people during their time. I fall somewhere in between these arguments. I agree that Confucius is chastising Zilu in some way. He recognizes his rash nature and knows it needs to be tempered. But I also don't see any need to connect the passage to 15.2 directly, since what we know about Confucius's view of Zilu is already more than enough to explain and justify it. As Cheng Shude says, those commentators speculating about misordered passages show a love for the unusual and a tendency to force interpretations. All right, folks, That's it for this time. Again, I'm your host, Elliot Bernstein. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Exploring the Analects. Don't forget to visit analects.net to check out the episode guide, and drop me a line at elliot@analects.net if you got questions or comments. Join me again next time when we'll be discussing passages 15.36 and 15.37, and learn when Confucius says it's totally fine to disobey your superiors. See you then.